Cyberpunk is a subgenre that has thrived in every medium, one of its most noteworthy endeavours being its achievements in anime. The ethos of cyberpunk is to show not the glamorous aspects of science fiction, but the grounded and ordinary. Focusing on elements such as the police, poverty, crime, the genre allows a level of realism to seep through the wires, immersing you with reality while maintaining a fantastical outlook. As a huge fan of science fiction, cyberpunk is one of my favourite elements of the medium. I love the scope in which society can be viewed, the iconic aesthetic, the cynical narratives. It's a subgenre with unlimited possibilities. In this video I'm going to go through some of my favourites in chronological order, discussing how each tackled and evolved the cyberpunk of anime. Akira is usually cited as a key starting point for cyberpunk in Japan. Although this is true of the manga, there were several shows before the Akira anime adaptation. A good place to start would be Megazone 23 and Bubblegum Crisis, two works that perfectly encapsulate the atmosphere and style of 80s cyberpunk. The dark and political themes we're used to seeing in cyberpunk today were established here, but they were contrasted by the bright pop attitude of the 80s. Megazone's comedic moments and the fact that Bubblegum's protagonists are music icons. It gave a playful element that was absent in much of science fiction but managed to maintain its level of severity due to the nature of cyberpunk. This is present through all the cyberpunk works of the 80s. We see multiple important motifs established in these works too that will become staples of the subgenre. Motorbikes would almost be a prerequisite for cyberpunk anime during the 80s, and long cityscape shots became essential. These looming pans over cities hold a special significance for cyberpunk anime, not only because they exhibit the progression of 2D animation in Japan at the time, but they're a reinforcement of the ideas and themes of the genre. Cyberpunk distinguishes itself from the rest of science fiction with its focus on society and the more dystopian aspects of its world. These city shots were usually used to show the massive imbalance of wealth throughout the city, panning from the narrative focal point at the foot of the city to the unreachable heights of its large skyscrapers. The sense of scale accomplished with these was remarkable and solidified the philosophies of cyberpunk. So we have this era of pre-Akira cyberpunk, that ironically took inspiration from the Akira manga that was being released throughout the decade. This all leads up to the most notable point of the decade, and not only cyberpunk but the medium as a whole, the anime adaptation of Akira. This was the furthest the medium had stretched the genre, perfecting the visuals and evolving the narrative. We mentioned the use of more comedic and brighter elements implemented into previous cyberpunk works. Akira turned this tradition in another direction, replacing moments of comedy with drama, moving music idols to government test subjects. This worked so well because the genre had already established this level of maturity and severity. There were sex scenes in Megazone, ultra-violent action in Bubblegum Crisis. It was all there, just waiting for someone to come along and bring it to life. Probably the most impactful element of Akira was the sheer scale of the movie. It aimed to push everything to the max, from the level of detail in the explosions to the extravagance of bike chases. Every piece of the movie was massive. Neo-Tokyo, Akira's setting, was no exception. The presentation of this city played a key role in the immersion of the movie. It needed to feel real. You needed to understand every detail of the world without having the movie explain it to you. This was achieved beautifully through Akira's detail and scale. Smaller shots offered vital details and larger shots showed the context of those details. The reason Akira had to show off its narrative rather than explain it through dialogue or exposition is because the story of Akira is incredibly large as well. Certainly nothing you could tell in just one movie. This is a talking point that circles any discussion of the movie. Personally, I really liked how they handled such an epic in such a short amount of time. Huge details of the story were expressed with few seconds of unexplained visuals in the movie. This isn't necessarily the best way it could have been told, but it didn't leave any gaps. Certain aspects of the world were obviously left needing more explanation, but it never felt empty. You felt as if every crack and corner of the city was brimming with detail and story. Every building and every bar was ridden with the damp world of Akira. Leaving both Akira and the 80s behind, we moved to the 90s, transitioning into a work that perfectly visualises that change. Cyber City is a 1990 OVA that's almost symbolic of what cyberpunk was and what it was about to become. With the ever-growing computer age and with the introduction of the internet, cyberpunk narratives in the 90s started to become more philosophical. Cyber City is the best example of the beginning of this change. It has everything you would expect from the subgenre, but adds a much greater focus on the deeper narrative. It offers the usual character-driven sci-fi action storyline, but has underneath a deeper narrative. Unfortunately, it was still too early and the questions were only briefly pondered. Cyber City sits on the edge of each decade and has become a kind of unique mixture of both styles. Macross Plus is another big step in the direction of the 90s style, once again adding a more serious tone to its narrative. It dabbles into the philosophical, but even now we still feel as if it's a hangover from the 80s. Akira's influence is unavoidable. One of the more notable aspects of Macross Plus was the visuals. Computers were crawling their way into the production of these shows as well as the narratives. You can really see just how useful the power of technology was with the amount of detail in this significantly smaller project. So first came Akira, then came Ghost in the Shell, to arguably greater impact. The film didn't just elevate or change the current stream of cyberpunk, it completely rewired not only cyberpunk or anime but science fiction in general. Few movies have had such an impact on the world of media. This perfectly timed masterpiece would be the basis for almost every single science fiction anime to follow, certainly changing the landscape of cyberpunk, and for the better. It kick-started an age of works unafraid to tackle difficult topics, presenting their themes in full depth and in full confidence. Ghost in the Shell was incredibly dialogue heavy, something most works shied away from, but it worked. With beautifully complex topics, Ghost in the Shell brought up themes previously kept in big books on the philosophy of science, and it managed to implement these into a narrative while balancing the other elements of the movie. This masterful handling of dialogue-heavy storytelling was massive for the development of cyberpunk. The location of the movie was important as well. Before, cyberpunk stuck to massive, incomprehensible cities. Ghost in the Shell based its location on cities that exist, adding a scary realism to the story it was telling, portrayed now in bleak, poverty-ridden detail instead of large, flashy monuments. This added a sense of realism to cyberpunk that had never really been achieved at this level by any other anime. One of the lesser discussed but more obvious influences was Motoko, the protagonist. She was female. It's obvious now that cyberpunk anime employ females as their focus, but if you look at post and pre-Ghost in the Shell, the evidence is surprising. A new wave of strong female leads were born. So when we think of cyberpunk, we mainly think older, 80s and 90s works. But as you'll see here, that's not exactly the case. From here on out, almost every single year hosted multiple accomplished cyberpunk titles, all thanks to Ghost in the Shell, Lane being one of my favourites and probably the most experimental. It takes the pre-established themes of the impact of technology and explores them in what is truly one of the most unique experiences out there. To have such a solid and evergreen understanding of the internet only a few years after its emergence is incredible. Similarly to Ghost in the Shell, Lane's themes and questions only become more relevant as time goes on. One of the other notable leaps made by Lane was its aesthetic. It strived away from the big cities and moved to a smaller location, spending most of its time indoors. Really, Lane was reserved in its situation. Being in a regular high school with regular looking females gave the more abstract elements of the series more weight. I'd like to also briefly mention the 2001 Metropolis film, a really great addition to the subgenre. It's one of the few cyberpunk anime that opted for such a contrasting art style, creating a cartoon style to ease the flow of its themes and narrative. Taking the visuals to a simpler level really let the story flourish. You'll see as time goes on, each show takes a step away from the classic cyberpunk anime that seem now a lifetime away. Technolize is no exception, more grounded than Lane but equally innovative in its narrative and design. We've established that cyberpunk showcases the lower ends of society, and none do that better than Technolize. Showing a dystopian future off in scarily realistic detail, it's very reminiscent of classic science fiction, telling a story of humanity's loss of control. What I loved about Technolize was how it told its story from the perspective of its characters. It didn't give the viewer any more information than them, giving us all the same sensation of being lost, causing the later events to have heightened impact. So Ergo Proxy is one I've recommended many times before. It's probably one of the most immersive and atmospheric sci-fi worlds. It does stray further away from our current society, but it builds its world with such believability. Like Ghost in the Shell, the series works off of its themes. It doesn't offer an A to B narrative, instead forcing the viewer to find their own version of Ergo Proxy within each episode. It's filled with fantastically layered dialogue and symbolism that have multiple implications to the series. Overall, it's one of the best science fiction works I've seen, certainly one of the best uses of cyberpunk. Be sure to post what you liked from what I mentioned, and any I didn't get to mention. Cyberpunk is certainly one of my favourite subgenres out there. I hope I gave a good enough overview in this video. Be sure to click the like button and share it around if you enjoyed. Cheers.